Hey everyone, why does Tucker Carlson sound like a shill for Vladimir Putin?
I do know because I've listened very carefully as someone who's been agnostic on Russia my entire life. Never had strong feelings about it ever. But I've listened carefully to people describe it in Washington at the policymaking level. And you always get this sense that they feel, and sometimes they even just say it, that they have a right to control what happens in Russia. And I've always been confused by that. Where does that right come from? It's like it's almost like an ownership. Like it was ours, and this guy called Putin showed up and like took it over, and he's illegitimate. And from my American perspective, I'm like, I don't know, whatever you think of Putin, but it's not my country. He was elected. He is very popular. No one can dispute that. All polls show that Putin is way more popular than Trump or any American leader has ever been since Teddy Roosevelt.
I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and that was Tucker Carlson speaking with the progressive influencer and journalist Glenn Greenwald about Russia and Putin. And somehow, whenever this topic comes up, Tucker sounds very soft, if not actually positive, about this dictator of Russia, which contrasts quite starkly with how he discusses Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi Netanyahu is actually the leader of a democratic country who's been democratically elected multiple times. And because he's waged defensive wars against terrorist forces that have affirmatively attacked Israel, Tucker portrays him as this horrible war criminal, whereas Vladimir Putin, a dictator of Russia, engaged in this unprovoked war of aggression on Ukraine and is just fine. A very popular and effective leader. I'm going to explain in this video how wrongheaded this is and how it ultimately goes to the noxious underlying ideology of Tucker Carlson. Couple things off the top. Yes, of course, Vladimir Putin won election initially, and then over time, over the years, over the decades, eliminated democratic politics in effect in Russia, banning opposition parties. Recently, he banned another one for the offense of calling for a ceasefire in Ukraine. Can't have that. He jails and poisons his political opponents, most notoriously Alexei Navalny, who was sent to the Gulag and died in fairly short order for the offense of wanting to run against Vladimir Putin and opposing his vision for Russia. As for people in the United States wanting to control Russia, supposedly, I spend a lot of time around Russian hawks. I've never met one who wants to control Russia. They might have very strong views about how Russia should be run and how it can be run in a more rational basis and one that supports the interests of the Russian people. But that doesn't constitute wanting to control Russia any more than Tucker Carlson allegedly wants to control Israel because he has very strong views about Israeli politics and how Israel should be run. But let's go to more of Tucker with Greenwald here.
I mean, Putin on the spectrum of Russian politics is firmly on the moderate side. I mean,
Yes.
right, and pro-European in his early career was in Europe in East Germany as a KGB officer. Famously, he speaks German. I mean, he's tried to join NATO. So this idea that like he is a Russian nationalist who hates the West on principle or for ideological reasons or whatever is like totally insane. And
Now, to American ears, whenever you call someone a moderate, that sounds like a good thing. Now, it might be literally true of Vladimir Putin. There might be more radical and ultra-nationalistic forces in Russia on one side to him, but this isn't a good thing, and it doesn't speak well to Russian culture, and it's important to understand some of the history here. Russia has always labored under what the historian David Satter calls a quasi-deification of the state. It has considered itself the so-called Third Rome after Rome itself and Byzantium, this center of the Orthodox faith. The church became an arm of the state, and the state itself became sanctified. Plus, there was this dire security environment that Russia always had to cope with potential Turkish or Mongol invaders always threatening, which led to the need of a vast military apparatus. The historian Richard Pipes describes the ensuing political arrangement this way. Under these conditions, there could be no society independent of the state and no corporate spirit uniting its members. The entire Russian nation was enserfed. There was room here neither for a privileged aristocracy, nor for a class of self-governing burghers, nor yet for a rural yeomanry. The great social scientist Samuel Huntington got to the same point, making it in civilizational terms. Huntington wrote of an Orthodox civilization centered in Russia and separate from Western Christendom as a result of its Byzantine parentage, distinct religion, 200 years of Tartar rule, bureaucratic despotism, and limited exposure to the Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, and other Central Western experiences. Now, there's always been some ambiguity about this because Russia's kind of straddled the border of Western civilization. Peter the Great was a tremendous Westernizer in Russian history, built St. Petersburg, a Western-style city, pursued all sorts of military, administrative, educational, cultural reforms prompted by the West. But the way he went about it was so typically Russian. This was the rule of a brutal, centralizing power. Now, all this goes to one of the main tensions in Russian history because Peter the Great's reforms prompt this reaction among the so-called Slavophiles who oppose it all because they think Russia is being taken off its true and distinctive path. Now, where does this leave us in terms of Vladimir Putin? Now, Carlson is right that initially Putin is pretty pro-Western. He says he wants Russia to become part of Western European culture, but that gives way over time. Yes, under the pressure of NATO expansion, but also in keeping with Russia's traditional resentments and insecurities in terms of those two poles you have in Russian history, the Westernizers of the Slavophiles. Putin becomes a Slavophile. And if you have any doubt about this, you can read it in his own words in this landmark 2007 speech he gave at the Munich Security Conference, declaring himself against the West and for all intents and purposes declaring a new Cold War. Putin believes in authoritarianism. He believes in a strong Russian state. He believes in a rehabilitation of the country's Soviet past, and he believes in a Russian civilization that is superior to Western civilization that has supposedly been corrupted by individualism and secular thought. He wants to reunite what he calls the Russian world, wants to protect what he considers the family of Slavs and the tens of millions of what he calls our citizens lost to the Russian state with the supposedly disastrous collapse of the Soviet Union. And it happens to be Ukraine's misfortune to be in his firing line. But I'm going to come back to that in a minute. First, here's another clip from Carlson in an interview with Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire last year.
If you think that Joe Biden was a better leader or a better man than Vladimir Putin, like, I don't even know what to say to you. That's insane. There's by no measure, did Joe Biden's country, the people he solemnly swore to help and defend, did they thrive? No, they withered. Putin, who's been there for 25 years, his country's improved. The people are happier. They like him, actually.
The war's been a little tough on Putin.
The war's, of course, it's been tough. Of course, it's been tough.
I'd be curious about public opinion today, this far into the war.
Well, actually, it's measured a lot. Yeah, look it up. And you can say, oh, that's all a lie. Okay, well, show me one.
Yeah.
Okay, go there.
Yeah.
And look, I'm not moving to Russia, but I mean, Putin has been the most effective leader in my lifetime. I can't think of a more effective one.
He's been a very stable leader for Russia.
But why is he more evil than Joe Biden?
Yeah, well,
I can't even conceptualize that. Like,
you know, you could say, look, I don't know his religious views, but he's promoted Christianity within Russia.
Aggressively.
Yes.
Okay, so that's Carlson obviously contrasting Putin, a good, strong, effective leader, with Joe Biden. Look, I have no use for Joe Biden. He was a terrible leader. He never should have been elected president. He never even should have thought of running for a second term, given his mental and physical state. But he wasn't poisoning his political opponents. He didn't engage in any cynical wars of aggression against neighboring states because he worried they're going to establish a stable democracy that might undermine his model of governance at home. As for Putin's effectiveness, I think you have to look at it in different phases. Now, if you throw out human rights, if you throw out liberty, throw out democracy, you don't care about those things. I do care about those things, but let's say you don't for the sake of argument. By the way, if Carlson's going to be consistent, he should care about them, because when he's talking about Israel and Netanyahu, he portrays himself as this moralistic Christian universalist, and all that's thrown out the window for some reason when he's talking about Putin. But if Putin retired in 2008, and again, you don't care about those very important things, I think he'd be remembered as a pretty effective ruler of Russia. He gets the country back on its feet after the economic disaster of the 1990s, and does, as Trump says about the US, he does get Russia respected again and return a sense of self-respect. Now, things are going to get worse and more authoritarian over time. Now, if on top of all the things I said you have to throw out to consider him a decent leader in 2008 or so, if you put on top of those throwing out any concern over international law or the sovereign rights of neighboring countries, and just think about the first invasion of Ukraine when he snatches Crimea from Ukraine, if he had stopped then and retired at that point, Russians also might remember him pretty fondly, but things get even worse from there. So what's the tally look like now? Putin has been a disaster for the interests of the Russian people and the Russian nation. There's been a huge brain drain in Russia since the beginning of the second Ukraine war. The best and brightest are leaving the country and they're not coming back. You've had enormous expenditure of resources in blood in a war that has not gone the way Putin has imagined and is dragging on without end. Now he's fundamentally broken the relationship with the West. He has obviously poisoned the relationship with Ukraine forevermore. And perhaps most importantly, if you're looking at this in the cold-blooded, clear-eyed, supposedly view that Tucker Carlson is offering us, he has made Russia a vassal of the Chinese state, something that any Russian ruler throughout its history would have feared and rejected. That is what Putin has done. And there was an alternate history available to him. Again, when he comes in, he's a kind of reformer, fighting some of the oligarchs, fighting the corruption that at least bothers people in their everyday lives. It's still a hugely corrupt country at the top, institutes a flat tax. There was a chance that Russia could be quite a rich country by now. But you know what? Putin probably feared if he created a class of wealthier people, those would be small d Democrats who would potentially challenge his rule. So at the end of the day, this was all about Vladimir Putin, who has embraced and expressed the worst parts of the Russian tradition because he thinks that is in his interest over and above the Russian people. So what is the attraction of all this to Tucker Carlson? To most of us, this doesn't sound so great, but clearly he is at the very least drawn to the model of this right-wing, supposedly Christian, traditionalist style authoritarianism in Russia that he thinks is stronger and smarter than the model of the modern West, than the model of modern liberal democracy that Carlson thinks is corrupt the same way Vladimir Putin does. Hey, by the way, comment, like, and subscribe. I promise you won't regret it. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.